He won her in a poker game. That's what they'd say in town, whispering over watered-down whiskey and cold cups of coffee. They'd say Colt Brannick, a man built like a mountain, as silent and grim as the rock itself, had played a hand of cards and walked away with a human being as his prize. And on the surface, they were right. The rain fell that night, a steady, miserable drone that turned the dust of the main street into a thick, sucking mud. Inside the saloon, the air was heavy with the smell of wet wool, cheap tobacco, and desperation. Colt sat in the corner, his hat pulled low, casting his face in a permanent twilight. He wasn't there for the cards. He was there for the man across the table, a weasel of a man named Tillo, sweating through his waistcoat, his eyes darting around like cornered rats. He was losing, and losing badly. The pile of chips in front of him had dwindled to nothing. Colt played slow, deliberate, his face an unreadable mask. He let Tillo bleed himself dry, one foolish bet at a time. Finally, Tillo slammed his empty glass on the table. "One more hand, you giant son of a—" he slurred, catching himself. "One more. All I got left." Colt didn't move. He just watched. He knew what was coming. He'd been waiting for it. Tillo swayed, fumbling inside his coat. He pulled out a bundle wrapped in a coarse, gray shawl. He set it on the floor beside him, and for a second it shifted. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The lazy chatter died. Even the bartender froze, a rag held halfway over a dirty glass. With a dramatic flourish, Tillo yanked the shawl away. A girl stood there, maybe 20, tall, slender, with black hair braided so tight it looked painful. Her eyes were the color of coal, and they stared straight ahead, seeing nothing, or maybe seeing everything. There was a stillness about her, a pride that defied the greasy floorboards and the leering eyes of the men around her. "My niece," Tillo announced, his voice slick with false bravado. "Not blood, brother's girl. He's dead. She's quiet. Won't give you no trouble." The words hung in the smoky air, ugly and sharp. Colt's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped in his cheek. The cards in his hand felt like dead leaves. This was the moment. The reason he'd ridden 3 days to this dusty, forgotten town. The reason he'd sat in this stinking saloon and endured Tillo's pathetic bluffs. He stared at the girl. There was no plea in her eyes. No fear. Just a void. An emptiness so profound it felt like a physical force. "Call." Colt's voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. The cards were turned. Colt's hand was nothing special, but Tillo's was worse. A collective sigh went through the room. It was over. Tillo cursed, spat on the floor, and grabbed his hat. He staggered toward the door, not even glancing back at the girl he'd just lost. He left her standing there, as if she were a piece of furniture he no longer had a use for. For a long, heavy moment, the saloon was dead silent. Then, the girl moved. She didn't wait for Colt. She didn't look at anyone. She simply turned and walked out the swinging doors, head held high, stepping out into the cold, relentless rain. Colt was on his feet in an instant. He tossed a few coins on the table to cover the drink he hadn't touched, and followed her out. The night air was clean and cold, washing away the saloon's stench. She was already 20 paces ahead, a lone, straight-backed figure moving through the mud, barefoot. The rain plastered her thin dress to her skin, but she didn't seem to notice. She just kept walking, one purposeful step after another. Colt shrugged off his heavy duster, the oiled canvas slick with rain. He caught up to her in 3 long strides and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched, a sharp, sudden stiffening of her entire body, but she didn't shrug it off. "Got a place," he said, his voice rough. "It's dry. Got a stove." She gave no answer. No sign she'd even heard him. The only sounds were the squelch of his boots in the mud and the steady drumming of the rain on the coat that now covered her. They walked in that charged silence, past the dark, shuttered windows of the town, toward the edge of the prairie, where his small, isolated ranch sat like a lonely ship on a vast, dark sea. His bunkhouse was little more than a shed, but it was solid, built of thick timber. He pushed the door open, the scent of dry wood and old leather spilling out. A small stove in the corner radiated a gentle warmth. "There's a cot," he grunted, pointing. "Stew on the table." He set a steaming bowl down, then gestured toward the single cot against the far wall. "I'll be in the barn." He didn't want to spook her. He wasn't sure what he wanted. Atonement, maybe. He turned to leave, but she moved, blocking his path. She finally looked at him, her dark eyes meeting his for the first time. They weren't empty now. They were sharp, analytical. She was measuring him, weighing him, looking for the truth behind the silence. He saw no gratitude in them, no fear either. He saw suspicion. He didn't try to explain himself. He just stepped back, giving her space, and pulled the door gently shut behind him. The barn smelled of hay and horses. He found a pile of old blankets, laid them out near his mule, and leaned his back against a rough-hewn post. An ache settled deep in his chest, an old, familiar companion. He wasn't cold. He wasn't tired from the ride. It was the weight of his own past, a ghost that never stopped following him. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. He was listening to the silence from the bunkhouse. He wasn't protecting her from the world. He was waiting to see if he needed to protect himself from her. Because that game of poker wasn't chance. It was a trap, and he had just sprung it. He woke before dawn, the ache in his bones a familiar alarm clock. The rain had stopped, and the first pale gray light of morning was spilling over the eastern plains. He stood, stretched, and walked stiffly from the barn to the main house, his eyes fixed on the bunkhouse door. It was slightly ajar. A knot of ice formed in his gut. He pushed the door open slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. The room was empty. The stew bowl was clean, sitting upside down on the small table. The blanket on the cot was folded with neat, precise corners. His duster was hanging on a peg by the door, still damp but meticulously straightened. She was gone. He scanned the muddy ground outside. Footprints. Barefoot. Leading away from the ranch, not toward the town, but west, toward the jagged, unforgiving line of the hills. She'd run. He should have expected it. He should be relieved. A clean break. His strange duty fulfilled. But he wasn't relieved. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This wasn't right. It was too easy. He turned his gaze back to the bunkhouse, and that's when he saw it. On the rough wooden pillow of the cot, something small had been left behind. It wasn't a note. It was a carving. A tiny, intricate bird whittled from a piece of scrap wood. An eagle, its wings spread wide. It was a marker, a sign, and it was a symbol he knew all too well from a life he'd tried to bury. A symbol used by the gang he used to ride with. A gang led by a ruthless man named Santiago. A man he'd betrayed. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through him. The girl wasn't just a runaway. She was a messenger, or a warning. Was this Santiago's way of telling him he'd been found? That the ghosts of his past were finally coming to collect their due? He grabbed the small carving, his fingers trembling slightly. This changed everything. His plan for quiet atonement had just exploded in his face. He hadn't rescued a victim. He'd invited the devil's own daughter into his home. He saddled his horse, his movements quick and efficient. He had to find her, not to bring her back, but to find out what she knew, to find out if she was the hunter or the hunted. As he rode out, the sun broke over the horizon, casting long, accusing shadows across the land. The whispers in town started almost immediately. He rode past the general store, and the men gathered on the porch fell silent, their eyes following him, with a mixture of fear and contempt. "Gone mad," one of them muttered, just loud enough for Colt to hear, "living with a savage." But it was old Mercy Giles, the town's herbalist and unofficial conscience, who met his gaze directly as he passed. She stood on her porch, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes missing nothing. You didn't win a girl, son, she called out, her voice raspy but clear as a bell. You were dealt a hand from the bottom of the deck, and I reckon the dealer is coming to collect. He spurred his horse, leaving her words and the town's judgment behind in a cloud of dust. The tracks were easy to follow in the soft earth. She was moving fast, with a purpose that belied her barefoot state. She wasn't wandering aimlessly. She was heading for a specific place, a place he knew, a rendezvous point. He found her 3 miles west, standing beneath a lone, skeletal cottonwood tree. She wasn't alone. A man was with her, and it wasn't an Apache warrior. It wasn't one of Santiago's cutthroats. It was Tillo. He was cold sober now, his face pinched and mean. He held a rifle loosely in his arms, not pointed at the girl, but at ease. They were talking, their voices low and urgent. They didn't see Colt approaching from the ridge above. Colt reined in his horse, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt like a fool, a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. The girl, he still didn't know her name, hadn't been escaping from Tillo. She hadn't been escaping to anyone. She was working with him. The whole thing had been a setup. The poker game, the pathetic act, the prize. It was all a lie. A carefully constructed play to get her onto Colt's ranch. But why? Colt drew his peacemaker, the click of the hammer cocking sounding deafeningly loud in the morning stillness. He had been played, used, and in his world that was a debt that could only be paid one way. He urged his horse forward, down the slope, his face set in a grim mask. The time for quiet atonement was over. It was time for a reckoning. He didn't charge in, he was smarter than that. He dismounted 100 yards away using a rocky outcrop for cover and approached on foot. The air was still, and he could hear their voices more clearly now. Supposed to be simple, Tillo was saying, his voice a low, angry hiss. You get in, you find it, you signal me. What were you doing, girl? Playing house? The girl's reply was cold, devoid of the fear or subservience she had feigned in the saloon. He's not a fool, Uncle. He watches everything. He sleeps in the barn. He carries that gun like it's part of his own arm. I needed time, Uncle. So the story had that much truth to it. But what were they looking for? Time is something we don't have, Tillo snapped. Santiago's getting impatient. He wants his map. He knows Brannick has it. The map. A cold wave washed over Colt. Of course, it was always about the map. The map to the fortune his old gang had stolen, the score that had torn them all apart. The fortune he had taken and hidden, not for greed, but to keep it out of their blood-soaked hands. He had thought the location was a secret known only to him. He was wrong. I know where he keeps his keys, the girl said. In the main house, on a hook by the hearth. He thinks I'm just a meek little squaw. He brought me stew. He gave me his coat. There was a note of contempt in her voice that chilled Colt to the bone. Men like him are all the same. They see a broken bird. They have to try and fix it. They're predictable. Tillo grunted. Good. Tonight. You get the map. I'll be waiting by the creek. Don't fail me again, Sia. Sia. Her name was Sia. And her name felt like a betrayal. Colt had heard enough. He stepped out from behind the rocks, his peacemaker leveled steady at Tillo's chest. Game's over, Tillo. Tillo spun around, his eyes widening in shock and panic. He fumbled with his rifle, but he was too slow. Sia gasped, her mask of cold confidence shattering for a fraction of a second. Brannick, Tillo stammered. This ain't what it looks like. It looks like you used your own niece as bait to try and rob me, Colt said, his voice dangerously quiet. It looks like you're working for a man I put in the ground years ago. A flicker of confusion crossed Tillo's face. What are you talking about? Santiago ain't dead. He's the one who sent me. Now it was Colt's turn to be confused. Santiago, I'm talking about your brother, Sia's father, the man I killed in the dust-up in Kansas. This was his secret, the reason for his guilt. He had killed her father in a shootout years back, a member of his own former gang, finding her, offering her a safe place. It was his clumsy attempt to balance the scales of his own soul. Sia stared at him, her dark eyes wide with a dawning horror, but not for the reason he expected. Tillo started to laugh, a wheezing, ugly sound. "My brother? You think he was her father?" He spat on the ground. "That worthless dog wasn't her father. He was just the man my sister was married to." Colt's mind reeled. The foundation of his guilt, the very reason for this entire charade, was a lie. "Then who—" he began, but he was cut short. In that moment of confusion, Sia moved. She wasn't a frightened girl. She wasn't a cold conspirator. She was a whirlwind. She lunged not at Colt, but at her uncle, grabbing the barrel of his rifle and twisting it with surprising strength. "You told me he killed my father!" she shrieked at Tillo, her voice raw with a pain that was utterly real. "You said this was for him, for justice!" The rifle discharged, the shot tearing through the air and kicking up dust harmlessly between them. Tillo shoved her back, his face a mask of rage. "Shut up, you stupid girl!" But the diversion was all Sia needed. It wasn't to help her uncle. It was for her. She wasn't trying to get the rifle. She was trying to get away from it. She broke free and sprinted, not toward Colt, not back toward the ranch, but toward the open plains. A third party had arrived, riders, at least a dozen of them, cresting the nearby hill. They weren't ranch hands. They were Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, rifles held at the ready. And at their head was a man whose face Colt knew with a sickening dread. Not Santiago. Someone far more dangerous. Chihalga, the real leader of the renegades, Sia's true father. Tillo looked from the approaching warriors to Colt, his face pale with terror. He had been played by everyone. He was a pawn in a much deadlier game. He raised his rifle toward the charging riders in a suicidal act of defiance. Colt didn't hesitate. He wasn't going to die for Tillo. He turned and ran for his horse, the sound of war cries and gunfire erupting behind him. He risked a glance over his shoulder. He saw Sia running toward the riders, toward her father. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a spy for Tillo. She was the princess of a renegade army. And the entire poker game, the lies, the map, it was all an elaborate, bloody piece of theater designed to get Chihalga's daughter away from her abusive uncle and smoke out an old enemy. He swung himself into the saddle, digging his heels into his horse's flanks. He had to get back to the ranch. He had to get the real map, not the one to the gold, the one that showed the only way out of this valley alive. He rode like the devil himself was on his heels. The thunder of hoofbeats from Chihalga's war party, a constant, terrifying drumbeat behind him. The ranch was his only sanctuary, his fortress. He'd built it for peace, but he'd built it like a soldier. Stone walls, clear sight lines, a deep well. He'd always known, deep down, that his past would come calling. He just never imagined it would wear the face of the girl he thought he was saving. He reached the house, leaping from the saddle before his horse had even skidded to a halt. He slammed and barred the heavy oak door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He ran to the window, peering out. They were coming. A wave of riders, spreading out, forming a loose, inescapable circle around his land. This wasn't a raid, it was a siege. His mind raced, trying to piece together the shattered puzzle. Sia hadn't been working with Tillo. She had been using him. She had manipulated her abusive uncle into selling her in a poker game, a desperate gamble to escape his clutches. She must have known Colt Brannick would be there. But how? Who told her? Chihalga? Had her father orchestrated this entire escape? And why him? Why lure her to his ranch? He looked at the hearth, the cold stones where a fire usually crackled. The map. Tillo thought it was for gold, but Chihalga would know better. Years ago, when their gang had imploded, Colt hadn't just taken the gold. He'd taken something far more valuable, a ledger. A book detailing every crime, every payoff, every corrupt official and land grabber they'd worked with, from Kansas to the territories. It was his insurance policy, his one and only bargaining chip, and Chihalga knew it was buried somewhere on this property. Sia was the key. Her father had sent her in, a Trojan horse, to get that ledger. Her escape from Tillo was real, but it served a dual purpose. The first shot splintered the wood of the window frame next to his head. He ducked, cursing, and grabbed his own rifle. The siege had begun. He moved through the small, fortified house, checking every angle. The bunkhouse where she'd slept was useless, too exposed. He was trapped in the main building. He had water from the well pump in the kitchen and enough ammunition to hold out for a few days. But they had numbers, and they had time. Through the window, he saw them. Chihalga sat on his horse, a commanding figure, his face grim and unyielding. And beside him was Sia. She was no longer wearing the drab dress she'd had on before. She was now in buckskins, her hair unbraided and flowing free. She held a rifle of her own, looking every bit the warrior princess he now knew her to be. Her eyes were fixed on the house. On him. Was there conflict in them? Regret? Or was it just cold, hard purpose? Had she felt anything when he'd put his coat over her shoulders? Or was that just another part of the act? The question gnawed at him, a poison more potent than any bullet. The day dragged on. They didn't charge. They were patient. They took pot shots at the windows, testing his defenses, forcing him to keep his head down. They were waiting for him to run out of water, or patience, or hope. Night fell. The plains, which had once been a symbol of his peaceful solitude, were now dotted with the campfires of his enemies. The land was no longer his. He was a prisoner in his own home. He sat in the dark, his rifle across his lap, the silence of the house a heavy shroud. He thought about the girl, Sia. He replayed every moment, her silent appraisal in the saloon, the way she'd stiffened when he'd touched her, the way she'd cleaned the stew bowl and folded the blanket. Were they the actions of a spy, or the ingrained habits of someone who had known nothing but servitude? Maybe she was both, a girl desperate to escape one cage, only to be used as a key to open another. He had to know. He crawled to the hearth, his fingers finding the loose stone at the base. It was a bluff. The ledger wasn't there. That was too obvious. He'd learned a thing or two about deception from the masters of the craft. He moved to the far wall, to the small, unassuming bookshelf that held a handful of worn-out volumes. He pulled one out, a tattered copy of Shakespeare. He opened it, but not to read. He ran his thumb along the inside of the spine, feeling for the small, hidden catch. He pressed it, and a section of the bookshelf swung inwards, revealing a dark, cramped space behind it. His bolt hole, his last resort. It led to a narrow tunnel that ended in the dry creek bed a quarter-mile away. But he wasn't going to run. Not yet. He returned to the hearth and pried the loose stone free. He reached inside the dark cavity and pulled out a decoy, a small leather-bound book filled with blank pages. He crept to the front window, took a deep breath, and yelled out into the night. "Chihalga!" The response was a tense silence. "You want the ledger? You can have it," he shouted. "But you're not the only one who knows what's in it. The sheriff in the next county over gets a letter if I don't check in. A letter with a few sample pages. You come in here, you kill me, and you hang every last one of your friends, from the judge to the land agent." He was bluffing. There was no letter, but it was a good bluff. He waited, his heart hammering. After a long moment, a voice called back. It wasn't Chihalga's, it was Sia's. "He doesn't want to talk, Bronick," she called, her voice clear and steady in the night air. "He wants you to send it out. Send it out, and he'll let you right away." "And you believe him?" Colt yelled back. There was a pause. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, carrying a different note, something that sounded unnervingly like sincerity. "No, I don't. That's why you have to talk to me instead." What game was she playing now? "Come to the door," she said. "Unarmed. I'll meet you halfway. Alone. I promise." He stared out into the darkness at the flickering campfires. This could be the final trap, the one that would cost him his life. But then he thought of her eyes in the bunkhouse. The way she'd looked at him, not with hate, but with a kind of desperate calculation. She wasn't just her father's soldier. She had her own war to fight. Against his better judgment, he laid his rifle down. He walked to the door, took a deep breath, and slid the heavy bar free. The night air was cool and smelled of sage and wood smoke. He stepped onto the porch, his hands held high and open, showing he was unarmed. Across the moonlit dirt, she emerged from the shadows between two campfires. She, too, was empty-handed. She walked toward him, her steps measured and sure. She stopped 20 paces away, a lone figure caught between the besieged house and the besieging army. "This has gone on long enough," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "It started when you walked into that saloon," he countered, his voice a low growl. A flicker of something, regret maybe, crossed her face. "My uncle, Tillo, he was a cruel man. My mother was his sister. When she died, he took me in. He told me my father was a white man, an outlaw who was gunned down by a rival. He said that rival was you." Colt stayed silent, letting her talk. "He said you had a map to a fortune that was rightfully my father's legacy. He filled my head with stories of revenge. He promised me that if I helped him get it, he would set me free. It was a lie. He would have never let me go." Her gaze was intense, unwavering. "I knew that, so I made my own plan." "Your father," Colt said. "Chihalga. This was his plan." She shook her head, a vehement, sharp motion. "No, this was my plan. I sent word to my father. I told him what Tillo was planning. I told him which town, which saloon. I knew. I'd heard the stories about you. The man who vanished. The man who walked away from the blood and the money. I gambled that you weren't like them. That if you want me, you wouldn't treat me like property." It was a desperate, insane gamble. A roll of the dice with her own life as the stake. "Why?" Colt asked, the single word hanging between them. "Why not just run to your father? And bring his war down on Tillo? My uncle was a coward, but he had friends, dangerous friends, men in town. A slaughter would have followed. This way, it was quiet. A drunk gambling away his niece. No one would ask questions. It was supposed to be my escape. My father was just supposed to be my way out once I was clear of Tillo." "But he doesn't want to let you go, does he?" Colt said, glancing toward the silent figures watching from the firelight. "He wants the ledger." "He believes it's his right," she said. "A weapon to protect our people from the men who have been stealing our land for years. The men whose names are in that book." "And you?" Colt pressed. "What do you believe, Sia?" She looked down at the ground for a moment, then met his eyes again. The warrior mask was gone. He saw only the girl, caught in an impossible position. "I believe that book will only lead to more bloodshed. It's a fuse, not a shield. My father, he sees justice. I see a fire that will burn everyone, guilty and innocent alike." Suddenly the pieces clicked into place. Her coming here wasn't a trap for him. Her plea to talk wasn't a trick. It was a desperate last-ditch effort to stop a war. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "The ledger," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Give it to me. Not to my father. To me. Let me be the one to decide its fate." He stared at her, this impossible girl who had upended his entire world. She was asking him to trust her. The girl who had lied to him from the moment he laid eyes on her. The girl whose father had his home surrounded. She was asking him to hand over the only thing keeping him alive, the only thing keeping the wolves of the world at bay. It was madness. It was suicide. And yet, he thought of the way she'd stood up to Tillo, the raw fury in her voice when she'd realized his betrayal. He thought of the way she looked at him now, not as a target, but as a potential and perhaps final ally. Before he could answer, a shout came from the line of warriors. It was Chihalga. His voice was like thunder. "Enough talk! The girl has failed. The deal is off, Brannick." Sia spun around. "Father, no! Give me more time!" "Time is over!" Chihalga roared. He raised his rifle in the air and fired a single shot. It was a signal. From the campfires, the warriors rose as one. They began to advance, a slow, deliberate, deadly wave. Sia looked back at Colt, her face etched with panic and desperation. "He won't listen! It's over!" Colt's mind raced. The tunnel was his only option for survival. But if he ran, he'd be leaving her to face her father's wrath alone. He'd be leaving that ledger behind, and sooner or later, they would find it, and the war Sia feared would become a reality. He made a decision. A reckless, stupid, and perhaps final decision. "Get inside!" he yelled, grabbing her arm. He pulled her toward the porch, her surprise giving him the second he needed. He shoved her through the open door and slammed it shut behind them, dropping the bar back into place just as the first bullets began to thud against the wood. The house was a trap once more, but now they were both caught inside it. "What are you doing?" she cried, her back against the door as the wood groaned under the assault. "You could have run." "Yeah," Colt said, grabbing his rifle from the floor. He moved to the window, chambering around. "I could have." He peered out. The warriors were advancing steadily, using the darkness for cover. It wouldn't be long before they stormed the house. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you?" Colt didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the approaching enemy, his finger resting on the trigger. He thought about his life of running. Running from the gang, running from his past, running from himself. He was tired of running. "Because you gambled on me," he said, his voice low and rough. "Seemed only fair I return the favor." He raised the rifle to his shoulder, took aim at the nearest shadow, and fired. The siege had entered its final, bloody chapter. The night exploded into a symphony of chaos. Gunfire echoed from all sides, splintering the wooden walls, shattering the remaining glass in the windows. Colt moved with a lethal economy, a ghost from a past life reawakened. He fired, ducked, reloaded, and shifted positions, making it seem like there was more than one man defending the small fortress. Sia, after her initial shock, proved she was indeed her father's daughter. She grabbed the rifle Colt had taken from Tillo, a weapon he'd left propped by the door, and took up a position at the opposite window. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They moved in a grim, unspoken rhythm, two lone soldiers against an army, their survival woven together, thread by thread, with every shot fired. The air grew thick with gunpowder and the smell of hot metal. Bullets tore through the walls, ripping through sacks of flour, sending white puffs into the air like departing spirits. A shot grazed Colt's arm, a hot, searing line of pain. He gritted his teeth and kept firing. He saw Sia flinch as a bullet slammed into the wall next to her head, showering her with splinters. But she didn't back down. Her jaw was set, her eyes narrowed in fierce concentration. In that moment, she was neither a victim nor a spy. She was a warrior, fighting for her own life, on her own terms. "They're trying to draw our fire!" Colt yelled over the din. "They'll rush the door when we reload!" "Then we don't reload at the same time!" she yelled back, her voice sharp and clear. It was a soldier's logic, simple, effective. He felt a grudging respect for her. She had been trained. An hour passed, then two. The assault was relentless. They were being worn down, their ammunition dwindling. Colt knew they couldn't last until morning. Chihalga was too smart, too patient. He would simply wait for them to exhaust their resources and then overwhelm them. During a brief lull in the fighting, as the attackers regrouped, Colt looked over at Sia. Her face was smudged with soot, her knuckles white where she gripped the rifle. "The tunnel," he said, his voice hoarse. "There's a way out, behind the bookshelf." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. "You told me you were tired of running." "I'm tired of running alone," he corrected her. "You go. Get out of here. Take the ledger with you. It's not in the hearth. It's in a false bottom in the flour barrel." Her eyes widened. The decoy book. It had all been a bluff. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "Because you were right," he said, his gaze locked on hers. "That book is a fuse. My plan was to use it to keep them at bay. Your plan is better. Destroy it. End this, before it burns everyone. She stared at him, a storm of emotions warring in her eyes. Trust, suspicion, fear, and something else. Something he couldn't name. We go together, she said, her voice firm. They'll be waiting. They'll expect me to have a bolt hole. One of us might make it. Both of us won't. He gave her a hard, grim look. I've got more blood on my hands than you can imagine, Sia. My scales are already tipped. Yours aren't. Now go. Before she could argue, a new sound cut through the night. Not gunfire. A voice. It was Mercy Giles. Chihalga, you backwoods devil. You call this a fair fight? Colt and Sia exchanged a look of stunned disbelief. They scrambled to the window. In the moonlight, they could see a lone wagon rolling slowly toward the ranch, a lantern swinging from its side. Old Mercy Giles stood at the reins, her face a mask of righteous fury. Behind her in the wagon bed were a dozen figures, the sheriff and a posse of deputies from the next county over. Chihalga's war party froze, caught between the fortified house and the armed lawmen. Sheriff Brody! Chihalga's voice boomed, laced with contempt. This is not your land. This is not your fight. Became my fight when your men crossed the county line, Chief, the sheriff called back, his voice calm and steady. And it became my fight when Mercy here told me you were trying to settle an old score with a man under my protection. Colt stared, dumbfounded. He wasn't under anyone's protection. Brody had a warrant for him a mile long. What was happening? Mercy had been his bluff. He'd never sent a letter. But the old woman was cannier than he'd ever imagined. She must have seen the riders, put two and two together, and rode for the only help she knew might make a difference. She hadn't ridden for Colt's sake. She'd ridden to stop a massacre. Chihalga was trapped. He could fight the posse, but it would be a bloody losing battle, and it would bring the full wrath of the territory down on his people. Or he could retreat. His pride warred with his pragmatism. Colt could see the struggle on the old warrior's face. Then Sia did something Colt never expected. She laid her rifle down, walked to the door, unbarred it, and stepped out onto the porch, her hands raised. Father! She called out, her voice ringing with an authority that silenced everyone. This is over. There has been enough blood spilled over old ghosts. She walked down the steps and into the no man's land between the two armed camps. She faced her father, her chin held high. This man, Colt Brannick, is not our enemy, she said, her voice unwavering. He killed a man who betrayed him, yes, a man who was my mother's husband, but not my father. He was a monster. My real enemy was Tillo, the man who used me, who lied to me, who sold me. Colt Brannick gave me shelter. He gave me a choice. He is an honorable man. She turned her gaze to Sheriff Brody. And this feud is not about revenge. It's about a ledger, a book that names every corrupt official who has helped steal Apache land for a decade, a book my father wants for war, but which should be used for justice. She looked back at her father, her eyes pleading. Let the law handle this. Let us choose peace. Chihalga stared at his daughter, his warrior's face a maelstrom of emotions, pride, anger, and a dawning respect. He had raised a diplomat, not just a soldier. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his rifle. He gave a sharp, guttural command. His warriors began to fall back, melting into the shadows from which they came. The siege was over. Chihalga was the last to leave. He paused, his eyes locking with Colt's across the clearing. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. It was an acknowledgement, a truce. Then he turned and vanished into the night. Sheriff Brody dismounted, his boots crunching on the dirt as he walked toward the porch. He stopped in front of Colt, his face grim. Brannick, it's been a long time. Sheriff, Colt said, his body tense. He was still a wanted man. This girl's story about a ledger, Brody began. Is it true? Colt looked at Sia, who gave a slight nod. It's true. It's in the flour barrel. Brody gestured, and two of his deputies entered the house. A moment later, they emerged, carrying the dusty, leather-bound book. The sheriff took it, his eyes scanning the first page. A low whistle escaped his lips. Well, I'll be, he muttered. This name's names I've been chasing for 5 years. He looked up at Colt, a strange expression on his face. You've been sitting on this all this time? It was insurance, Colt said quietly. Looks like your policy just paid out, Brody said. He clapped the book shut. This ledger, and the testimony of this young lady. I reckon it's enough to clear that old Kansas warrant. You were defending yourself from what I hear. And the men you put down were wanted in 3 territories. Colt felt a weight lift from his shoulders that had been there for a decade, a weight so constant he had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. He was free. Brody tipped his hat to Sia. Ma'am, you're a brave woman. He then turned to Colt. You've got a good place here, Brannick. Don't waste it. With that, the sheriff and his posse mounted up and rode off, leaving Colt and Sia standing alone in the quiet aftermath, the rising sun painting the eastern sky in hues of pink and gold. The silence that fell between them was different now. It wasn't the silence of suspicion or of unspoken trauma. It was the silence of shared survival. The quiet space where something new and fragile could finally begin to grow. She walked up the steps and stood before him. You gambled on me, she said softly, echoing his earlier words. Yeah, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I did. Was I worth the price? She asked, her dark eyes searching his. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time without the ghosts of the past standing between them. He saw her strength, her courage, her fierce heart. He saw the woman who had walked through hell and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. Sia, he said, his voice softer than he thought possible. You were never the prize. You were the jackpot. A small smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her. It was like the sun rising after the longest night. In that moment, he knew the game was finally over. The debts were paid. The ghosts were laid to rest. And for the first time in a very long time, the future felt like an open prairie instead of a dead-end canyon. This wasn't a story about a man who won a girl in a poker game. It was a story about 2 people who were dealt the worst hands imaginable, and together, they found a way to win it all. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and unexpected courage, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the shadows. And let us know in the comments, who do you think was the bigger gambler, Colt or Sia? We'll see you in the next one.